Andre, we have a couple questions, and the next two look to be somewhat similar. I would love to know more about how Andre helps multicultural teams, especially their team leads. For example, brainstorming how could we work more effectively? And then in my small multicultural team, I found the most difficult to communicate with higher context culture like Serbia and Poland. I try not to judge them and engage with them with empathy, but where do I draw the line that they also meet me halfway? Low context world.
Lovely. Well, there are there is a multitude of facets to that question, right? So, those of you who had the chance to attend any of our CQ Center programs, such as CQ for Teams or Enhancing Team Leadership through Cultural Intelligence, might be familiar with the activity which we call team mapping activity. And I do want to talk about this one because if you lead culturally diverse team, having different behavioral preferences represented in the team, doing a team mapping activity can be quite powerful. And honestly, that's what I do with most of the teams who I work with. So what it means is that we literally create a cultural map or team map of behavioral preference, if you want. So we visualize the similarities and differences in those 10 behavioral preferences that we at Cultural Intelligence Center work with. And that's only the first step. Then the second and even more important step is to look together as a team at that map and reflect on where do we see those similarities or differences influencing or impacting the way we work as a team, and where do we think we need to fine tune our team culture. So our participant who asked this question asked specifically about how to work more effectively with some of the team members who show preference for high context communication. So I think there is no need for drawing the line here, right? So instead, I would rather choose to really look into that team map and discuss all together, include myself as the leader, but also the team members, and talk about, okay, so your preference is for high context communication. Me, as the leader of this team, I might be much more explicit or straightforward in the way I like to communicate. So let's discuss all together what would be the common conversational framework that would support all of us. So what we are doing here is not to try to change each other or tell the other that you need to become different, but together we are discussing what would be a communication framework that is respectful towards my low context way of speaking and at the same time towards your high context way of speaking. So team map can be pretty useful tool in similar situation.
I love that idea. That's great. We've got another question. An area of leadership research is the idea of followership. How do you suggest CQ is incorporated for the follower? How should followers adapt, address bias as well?
Interesting. Now, of course, I don't have the luxury since we are recording this Q&A later after the webinar. I don't have the chance to ask this participant to elaborate deeper on the question, especially
Right.
from the perspective of followership, right? Because
Mhm.
there are different angles of what do we mean by followership in regards or in connection to leadership styles. But assuming that our participants refers to what Robert Kelly defined as followership back in 1992. He talks about two important aspects of followership. He talks about a combination of critical thinking and engagement. So, what is the level of critical thinking of a follower, and what is the level of engagement of a follower, right? And then he comes up with five different types of followers, if this is what our participants refers to in his or her question. And so Robert Kelly came up with those five profiles, and he calls them a follower who is identified or labeled as passive follower. Then we have a conformist follower, alienated follower, pragmatist follower, or exemplary follower. So what's the connection between this idea of followership and CQ? Well, first of all, I would start with the fact that to me, this typology of followers sounds somewhat judgmental, right? So if you take the example of the exemplary follower, so this is to suggest that there is one preferred way of followers, right? And in the intercultural world, we know that there is no either or. It's not this is better, this is worse. The intercultural world is much more rooted in the principle of what we call cultural relativism. So the way we look at difference is, okay, so what is the upside of this way of working? What is the downside of this way of working? And so on. So we try to look at them from a multitude of perspective, which takes us away from this ambition to label some behavioral preferences as more effective than the other. So that would be one step that I would suggest to apply how to use CQ when trying to make sense of the followership theory of leadership. Okay. And then another one, when it comes to followership, that comes to my mind is again to look at the followership from the perspective of some of the behavioral preferences. Because who is a follower, right? How does critical thinking and engagement show? Well, some people who have a preference for high power distance, they might be showing their followership to the leadership or to leaders in a different way compared to someone who prefers low power distance leadership style, right? Then in terms of communication, so how do I show engagement? Because again, Robert Kelly talks about two aspects of followership, critical thinking and engagement. So if I'm someone who is emotionally non-expressive, for example, how am I going to be understood from the perspective of engagement, as engaged or disengaged, right? If I'm
Mhm.
not emotional expressive, how am I going to be understood in terms of the engagement? So I think applying CQ model to really redefine the categories or the five profiles of followership, and at the same time look at those ways how these five profiles demonstrate their followership through the lenses of our behavioral preference. So that's where I see overlap between CQ and the theory of followership.
Yeah, and I like how you related that to being more that cultural relevance being more of a spectrum
Yeah,
than a right or a wrong or a good or a bad or a high or a low. I like that
right.
a lot. Okay. Another question. How can we use CQ and EQ to improve our ability to create psychological safety within our teams? I think this is a great question for application.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we talked about it pretty much during our webinar, right? When we were trying to understand the difference between IQ, EQ, and CQ. So I was giving a lot of concrete examples between EQ and CQ, and at the same time, helping the audience to understand when is it that we need the use of EQ and when is it that we need to use CQ as a framework, right? But I would say, just to give a simple idea to the participants about how to combine both frameworks, EQ and CQ, to create a
Mhm.
psychologically safe space. So my suggestion would be to define together with the team members a set of guiding principles for how we are going to interact. I'm not talking about the team culture. Team culture is much more robust, much more complex if you want. But here I'm talking about the basic set of guiding principles, right? For example, assume positive intention. Right? So
Mhm.
whatever happens in our team, in the way we interact, try to assume positive intention. Why is that important? Because more often than not, when we work across differences, people do or say things that might create negative impact on me.
Right.
But did they really mean something negative, right? Did they mean to hurt me, offend me, threaten
Mhm.
me, judge me, and so on? Eventually, they did not, because more often than not, people do have positive intention. So that could be one principle. So whatever happens, whatever impact someone else's actions and words have on you, try to assume positive intention. And if you cannot, then be curious as a second guiding principle. Be curious and explore. Try to understand what their initial intention was. And as you engage in the dialogue with the other person about what did they intend to achieve with their words or actions, try to listen with the goal to understand, not to respond. right?
Mm.
And so this is an example of three simple principles that are very much rooted in emotional intelligence because they help us to practice curiosity as an emotion and empathy, right? So we are curious about their intention and empathetic because we try to listen to understand. So that's the EQ aspect in these guiding principles. How are they connected to CQ? Well, I'm trying to understand someone else's way of working, thinking, communicating, and so on. So that's how you can combine both of these EQ and CQ frameworks.
Great. It's great. The next question, and I know this is a hot topic for us in the company as well as for everything I'm reading. What is your vision for AI to drive CQ or human-based driven strategies work the most efficient still?
Hmm. First of all, I like to challenge the term AI, and I know that we are going to use the term AI because it's the common language we use to talk about artificial intelligence. So
Right.
I'm being realistic here. I don't expect that we will stop using the term, but we need to be realistic about what do we understand under the term of AI. Artificial intelligence in reality has nothing to do with intelligence itself, right? So the whole webinar that we had a couple of days ago was about
Right.
defining what is human intelligence. And there are certain elements to human intelligence. So there is this emotional or motivational aspect of human intelligence, be it EQ or CQ. There is the cognitive aspect of human intelligence, the metacognitive aspect, and the behavioral aspect. If we apply this four-dimensional view of human intelligence, be it emotional or cultural intelligence, then if you look at AI, you see that AI doesn't possess yet the emotional aspect of the intelligence, right? So AI
Yeah.
does not have emotions. It doesn't.
Right.
And it will take some time because humans are not fully clear yet on what emotions actually are, where are they being produced in the body, is it mind, is it heart, is it brain, where is it exactly, right? So there
Sure.
is not a common scientific understanding of what emotions are and what they do, what they don't do. So it would be very difficult for humans right now to program emotions into AI, right? So that's number one. So
Yeah.
there is no emotional element of artificial intelligence. AI doesn't have metacognitive element as an important aspect of intelligence. It looks like AI is thinking about the answers, but it's not. So AI doesn't make conclusions or doesn't offer you answers to your questions based on reflection, but simply based on evaluations of cognitive facts. That's what AI does currently. So AI is all about cognitive processing of data that have been loaded into the machine. That's where we are in terms of AI today. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's far from the complexity of human intelligence. That's number one. Number two, whatever outcomes we get from AI, we as humans who are able of metacognition, the reflective thinking upon knowledge, we need to
Yeah.
challenge the outcomes. And here is where CQ is so important because whatever answer we get from AI, we need to challenge it through the cultural lenses. Would this answer be really replicable or relevant in any cultural context, right? Or does it depend? Like, look, the other day, I made an experience with AI, which is not directly connected to CQ discussion, but it shows you how important and critical it is to question the outcomes that we receive from AI. I was reading a book. And so I was reading the book on one of my long flights. It was in English. English is not my native language. So when I landed, I felt like I'm not sure if I got the story right. I'm confused. So I used AI and I asked, okay, this is the book that I've just read, and I'm not sure about my understanding of the story. So what's the story about? Now I get the answer from AI. I'm reading the answer. I'm like, what? I I understood the story completely wrong. So AI is telling me completely different story, and I didn't even catch in that book that this is what happened. And it
Yeah.
kind of resonated with me and I couldn't get it out of my head. And I was like, how could I have misunderstood to this extent the whole story, right? It doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
So I went through some of the pages of the book again And I was like, no, I did understand correctly. What AI is saying is completely wrong. So I did go back to AI and I said, you lied to me. So I was having an argument with AI, and AI said, you are right. I didn't give you the right answer. Let me correct my answer. And it gave me, once again, a different story, which was not correct, right? It was not a real
Wow.
story. And I kept arguing. I said, no, this is not true either. So you need to give me the proper answer here. And then I saw the notification in AI tool, it was ChatGPT, which said, okay, I'm initiating deep search. So until that moment, it was staying on the surface only, scanning through the most available
Yeah.
resources related to that book. And only when I started questioning and challenging the outcomes, then it started what we call deep search. So that's why I say that we have to be really cautious and look at the answers from the perspective of CQ and challenge. Okay, would this answer would be accurate, appropriate, correct, fair, just in any cultural context?
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think that coincides with, what some feedback and some people are saying online as well, is that it's not there yet and it, still has a ways to go. And so be cautious.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
obviously, that means that whoever designs the AI and develops AI technologies must be culturally intelligent because the way they write codes, they write the algorithms, it has to be done in a culturally sensitive, culturally intelligent way to make sure
Yes.
that we do write those algorithms through a multitude of cultural lenses, right?
Yes. 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 That's great. This one's great. How do you show an organization that the time to implement CQ is worth the investment?
I would probably use different approach and I would discuss with the organization what's the cost of not using CQ, right? And
Okay.
so I would be talking about, okay, so tell me what's going on in the organization. What are the challenges? Every organization does face challenges, right? So I haven't uh, come across an organization who would say, oh, we don't have any issues at all, right? So every organization does have challenges. And so instead of forcing the language of CQ right from the beginning, first I would like to understand and explore the challenges because that gives me an idea if some of these challenges could be addressed through the lenses of CQ. And so once we go through the challenges, then it's way easier for me to come and say, well, I might have some tools that might help you to address some of these challenges, and it's called CQ, right?
Right. Right. Love it. The next question is, I appreciate that we should not underestimate the importance of CQ drive. I often think of that as internally motivated. Any tips on how we might help others become more curious and increase CQ drive?
Hmm. Well, I do remember the long conversation that we had during webinar about the importance of CQ Drive, and I said, well, it's ineffective to spend a lot of time talking to someone about behavioral preferences, about cultural differences, the need for bridging those, and so on, if that person is not driven, if the person has low CQ Drive, right? So
Right.
the question refers to that part of our conversation most probably. And so I do agree with our participants when he or she says that it's an internal category, right? And this is
Right.
important to recognize because it's not in my zone of control to motivate other people or make them curious. I cannot do that, right? However, I can create a landscape or environment and hold a space for them so they can start feeling curious, right? And so, how can I do that? So, last time I was mentioning the need for EQ in similar moments. So, when I see an individual scoring lower on CQ drive, before talking about how to increase CQ drive, I try to use emotions to understand why the CQ drive is low right now, why there is not curiosity, because the person might feel frustrated by differences. That's an emotion that needs to be addressed. Maybe the
Right.
person tried in the past, was curious, and got disappointed. Disappointment is an emotion and it needs to be addressed. Maybe the person feels skeptical about being effective when working across differences. Skepticism is an emotion, right? So before prescribing recipes for how to make someone curious, first I need to understand the diagnosis, right? So first I need to understand what's the problem. And the problem is typically of not of emotional nature, of emotional character. So as a facilitator, as a coach, I try to understand the dominant emotion here that is pulling CQ drive down. And only then I feel that, okay, now we can talk about how to be more curious, how to be more interested in the others, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think this question is one that we will probably be asked over and over and over again because I think it's probably one of the most challenging if you are seeking to have a culturally intelligent team or organization. It's probably the
Right.
most, challenging to motivate the motivation, if that's the thing.
Hmm.
Is it possible to develop the CQ drive if it's not enough? Very similar question, and I think you've just answered that. Let's move on. Um, You spoke in the webinar about some Islamic psychology, and we have a question of what was your source? What were you referring to for that basis of Islamic psychology?
Islamic psychology is a relatively new field within psychology. So I would mention one important name in the field of Islamic psychology, Dr. Malik Badri, Malik, Malik Badri, Badri. He was a clinical psychologist from Sudan. And he got his PhD in the UK, however. And so he's considered one of the founders of Islamic psychology back in the 70s. And his key dilemma that he was trying to solve was how to make the Western psychological concepts and frameworks relevant for people of Muslim faith. And
Mhm.
so he did an amazing research. He published books, and basically he talks about four aspects of human behavior, right? So ego, brain, heart, and spirit.
Mhm.
And so if you explore a little bit deeper these four dimensions, you can see certain connection to four dimensions of CQ model, CQ drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. I don't want to go into details, but I would encourage you to look up the work of Dr. Malik Badri. Another research would be to study old Islamic philosopher, which might be a challenging read because these are not easy books because some of them come from 11th or 14th century. But Al-Ghazali is one of the most prominent Islamic philosopher, not necessarily psychologist because we haven't or we didn't talk about psychology back then in the 11th century. But Al-Ghazali is perceived as one of the most prominent Islamic scholars and philosophers of the time. And Dr. Malik Badri basically deeply studied his work of Al-Ghazali and the framework, the four-dimensional framework of human behavior that he created was very much connected to the work of Al-Ghazali. And if our participant who asked this question wants to make it more formal in terms of the education in the field of Islamic psychology, I would bring to their attention the Cambridge Islamic College.
Okay.
So, Cambridge, UK, they have this College for Islamic Studies. They do both in-person studies and online studies of what we call Islamic psychology.
Okay. Great. How can one be intentional at college level with international students and CQ?
I would need to understand deeper that question. I'm not sure what is that we try to achieve with CQ. Is it bringing CQ into the structure of the college, into the systems? Is it about making the campus international and culture
Mhm.
intelligent? Is it about developing CQ in students? So I hesitate to
Give
give
me
the
more.
answer because I'm not sure if I understand the question properly.
Yeah, I can see that. And I know just from the CQ Center that we work at the college level quite frequently with professors
Right.
who are looking to provide training and deploy the
Yes.
assessment. So there's so many different ways this can be taken. I agree with you. What is the difference between having a high CQ and being simply naturally nice and empathetic?
Hmm. I can be nice and very culturally insensitive, right?
Mm,
So I can be a nice person to you and tell you nicely that, look, we are going to do the project my way, Courtney, because I think it's much better, right? And I'm
mm,
saying it in a very nice way, right? And you might appreciate my politeness and being nice, but it doesn't mean that it will work for us, right? So being nice is far from sufficient. Empathy is an important element of cultural intelligence or of being culturally intelligent. But once again, it's not sufficient. Why? Because empathy, in the language of psychology, we talk about empathy as being emotion, not doing emotion. So being empathetic means that I am with you in your emotion. I don't even have to feel the same emotion to be empathetic. I don't even have to understand your situation. But being empathetic means being genuinely curious. Tell me more about what's going on. I see that you're frustrated. What frustrates you, right? That's empathy,
mm,
but it's a being emotion. So I am with you. But being culture intelligent takes an action, right? Being culture
mm.
intelligent is not about being empathetic with you or understanding your situation. The whole CQ framework is also about taking an action on what we know.
I love that. CQ equals action.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. If we inadvertently offend someone, should we always apologize and ask for a better way to connect? And I think within the webinar, you masterfully gave an example of a situation
Yes.
like this. Um,
Yes. So I would just remind our audience of the conversation that we had, intent versus impact, right? So if I create a negative impact or leave negative impact on someone, so I will not be orthodox and say you have to or you don't need to apologize. I leave that up to the discretion of everyone, right?
yeah,
When I create a negative impact on someone, it's not that I have to apologize. It's about acknowledging that I did create negative impact, right?
right.
And I might not have a bad negative intention necessarily. So I do acknowledge that I made you feel the way you do feel. I am acknowledging that. Now let me help you understand what was my initial intention, right? So you also
Right.
understand my perspective. Yeah. So
Yes.
that's what we were discussing during the webinar.
Yes. The next question says, you talk about CQ in various levels of culture, not just national culture. Is there any difference when approaching national culture and, for example, religious differences? I mean, facilitating CQ helps in all cultural levels.
I would say yes, direct answer, because when it comes to culture, and honestly, I don't recall if we defined culture during our webinar, most probably not, but the way we look at culture is that whenever we have a group of people with certain shared patterns of beliefs, morals, assumptions, and behaviors, and this group is different from any other group with their shared patterns of beliefs and behaviors, that's when we talk about a culture, which is why we don't talk about culture only at the national level, about country cultures. We also talk about team cultures. We talk about organizational cultures.
Yeah.
Departments have their culture. We talk about job-specific cultures. We talk about generational cultures. And CQ model can be applied to any type of culture, right? Because
Mm,
if you think of CQ knowledge only as the cognitive capability, right? So it's about understanding what's different, what's similar. So the four subdimensions of CQ knowledge are applicable to any culture, right? So cultural systems, we need to understand the cultural system of any culture. Sociolinguistics, we need to understand the language of any group of people, right? Because they might be using their own acronyms, their own words that might be specific for this group of people only, and so
right.
on. So if you look at any capability of cultural intelligence, including all the subdimensions, they are absolutely applicable to any culture, be it national culture, generational culture, team culture, and so on and so on.
Yes. I think that's great. Great answer. How does one know and measure when someone has gone too far in adapting to a culture? Is there a fine line between the boundary of sensitivity and self-erasure? And you did answer this one within the webinar, but I think that idea of going too far, is there too far?
Look, I think the best benchmark for saying if I'm going too far or not is myself. So the question is, how authentic do I feel in what I do, right? As long as I still feel authentic in that adjustment, it means that it's still okay for me, right?
Mhm.
Once I feel like, oh, this is not me anymore. I'm trying to adjust here, but I don't feel myself anymore. That's the red line, right? That
Mhm.
that would be my approach. I'm sure if you ask other people, you might get different perspective, but I would use myself and my inner line as the benchmark because I need to know what feels comfortable to me and what feels that I'm detached from who I am.
Yeah, yeah, great. This question is very specific. Have you ever advised teams working in urban planning? Any thoughts on how to best approach engagement for diversified cities?
First answer, no, I haven't. Second answer, probably the very initial idea that I would have is to understand the demography of that community. Who are members of our community, but who are they, not only from age group or nationality group or their religious beliefs and so on, but what are their needs, right? So what
Mm,
is it that they would
neat.
need to thrive more in being members of this community, of this city, or of this village, whatever, right? So that's the very first thing I would start with, understanding who are members of my culture and then do an audit of what are we offering to our community and is our current offer relevant for every community or city member or for few only. That would be my approach. But no, I have not had the opportunity to work on similar project.
Yeah. No, but I do love your approach that you start with needs and then
Hmm.
identify commonality of needs. That's really thoughtful. There are so many cultural intelligence, intercultural, and other competency assessments available. For example, the IDI. What makes CQ more superior than other assessments?
First of all, I don't think CQ is superior. I don't want to use that language, right? Because it might sound a little bit arrogant to suggest that CQ model is superior to all the other intercultural frameworks. And I don't think that level of arrogance is aligned with being culture intelligent because it is rather the opposite. Culture intelligence makes us humble, right? Because we simply know how much we don't know being culturally
Yeah,
intelligent, right?
yeah,
And so I don't think it's superior. I think and this is not my subjective opinion. If you just look at some of the papers that have been peer-reviewed and published by people who are not necessarily connected to CQ, but who looked at CQ as an external observer, they came up with clear statements. So, for example, there is one paper that is available on the webpage of CQ Center, which compares 10 most frequently used intercultural effectiveness assessments, including CQ. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think IDEA was part of that comparison as well. And it was CQ that has been or that achieved the highest score of reliability and validity, which is to say that what CQ claims to predict, it really does predict these things, right? So that's what we mean in a very simple way by saying high level of validity and reliability. So it is rather external bodies or external group of social scientists who say that CQ is different for the level of reliability and validity and many more aspects. And I mean, we talked a lot about what makes CQ framework different compared to other intercultural frameworks during the webinar. So that question eventually was answered during the webinar
yes,
right away. Yeah.
yes, yes. Okay. The last question here. How can we learn more about motivations and purpose behind emotions? That is fascinating, but also feels empowering.
Hmm. All right, so that probably refers back to the conversation that we had about how every emotion, and humans have 200 different emotions. Well, I should rephrase. It's not that we have 200 emotions. In psychology, we can describe in very detailed way 200 distinct emotions. Maybe there are more that are not being or that haven't been explored yet. Let's put it this way. So
Hmm.
those 200, we can look at them from a perspective of three layers, right? And that's how we look at emotions in what we call ontological psychology. Ontological from the perspective of existential, right? So what's the purpose of each and every emotion? So what are those three layers of every emotion? So number one, it's the context. Every emotion appears in a specific context, in a specific situation, right? When reality does not match my expectations, there is either frustration that comes to my life to inform me that, hey, it's different from what you expect. So either I feel frustrated or disappointed, right? So these two emotions, disappointment and frustration, share similar context, and that is reality does not match your expectation. So every emotion has certain context in which
Okay.
they appear to inform us about what's happening. That's number one. Number two, the second layer or second dimension of every emotion is what we call purpose. Why we've been given that emotion to our emotional repertoire as humans. There must be a purpose, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be given that emotion. Why would we have it, right? So, what's the purpose of skepticism? What is the purpose of happiness? What is the purpose of pessimism, right? So there is a meaning behind each and every of those 200 emotions. So that's number two. And number three, the third dimension or third layer of every emotion is what we call impulse. Because we said that emotions are the energy that moves us to certain actions. That's why we call them emotions from Latin emovere, to move to something, right? So when I feel optimistic about something, to what action is optimism trying to move me towards, right? That's the impulse. So what impulse is this emotion giving me? So story or context, purpose, and impulse. These are the three layers of every single emotion. Now, the question was, where can we learn more about it? So I can think of the book called The Unopened Gift, written by Dan, D-A-N, Newby, Newby. And it's a very good practical book which describes a good number of emotions from the perspective of these three layers that I just mentioned.
Fascinating, truly. That's the end of our question list.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much.
This has been fantastic.